The older or more mature we get, the more we appreciate how wonderful hindsight is. Wonderful, if not sometimes rather challenging. Those times when we come to realise that God had been with us in a difficult or upsetting situation. Those times when, as we look back, we can discern God's support or action in our lives, which we'd failed to appreciate at the time. Moments of this kind remind us of how hindsight can be a blessing. Of course, hindsight can also awaken in us the realisation of those times when we've been dumb or, even worse, have been unkind or hurtful or sinful in some other way. At those moments, while perhaps even more important to our growth in self-understanding, hindsight can be challenging. It's hindsight, of course, that is the critical factor in the story of Cleopas and, I rather suspect, Mrs. Cleopas, who had that unique 7-mile walk one springtime in Israel. A walk undertaken in what must have been a spirit of dejection and despair, a walk which must have been tiring and which ends with night about to fall and an almost palpable sense of exhaustion that is not simply from the physical act of walking 7 miles on a hot afternoon. Were not our hearts burning within us? They suddenly realise. Wasn't that the best Bible study ever? Wasn't it good to have our minds opened to what God had actually been doing in our midst? And this is the real value of hindsight, their newly acquired insights bring transformation. Exhaustion and night time no longer weigh them down, either spiritually or physically. That same hour, we are told, they got up and returned to Jerusalem. Mr. and Mrs. Cleopas have allowed their hindsight to bring about a complete 180-degree total about turn, an utter transformation. And as they head back to Jerusalem, they are transformed into being evangelists, because they cannot keep that wonderful feeling of burning hearts to themselves. It's something that they feel compelled to share. And so they tell their friends and companions what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread, which is exactly how it's meant to be for us as well. The writer we know as Luke doesn't simply tell us about Cleopas and his companion because it's a lovely story from history. He tells us this story because, just as Mr. and Mrs. Cleopas are transformed, so Luke wants all his hearers and readers to be transformed. Because the stories of the gospel are stories of transformation, and Luke in particular loves to tell such stories. The transformation of a son who went on a wild and sinful spending spree. The transformation of a wounded man who discovered that, of all people, it was a Samaritan who cared for him. The transformation of a young virgin who discovered that God's Son was growing in her womb. And the transformation of a rather hapless pair of disciples walking home in the tiring heat of the afternoon sun, believing that their best and greatest hopes had been irrevocably dashed. Irrevocably dashed until they recognised the presence of God and realised how wonderful it was that God was actually in their midst, caring for them in their unnecessary grief. And with their hindsight, with that incredible memory of how wonderful it had been to encounter the living Word of God, they are compelled to go and share this unstoppable good news, which is the task to which we are all called by the risen Christ as he walks ever ahead of us, calling us on into a future of resurrection life. Well before this pandemic interrupted our lives, we had discovered the horrors of what we have learnt to call fake news, and the spread of the coronavirus has done nothing to inhibit it. My friend Jim Walters, who preached so powerfully for us at St. James last Holy Week, has written an article in which he reminds his readers that the Black Death led to what he refers to as an unprecedented outbreak of anti-Semitism in Europe and sets out how Jews in the 14th century were irrationally accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. More worryingly, he makes the point that commentators today have noted both anti-Semitic hate speech around the spread of COVID-19 and equally bigoted claims against Muslims, saying they are deliberately spreading the virus. Jim's article finishes with a much-needed plea that believers from all faiths should look within their own traditions for the resources of compassion that will reach across divisions in this time of shared fear and loss. Mr. and Mrs. Cleopas thought they knew all about shared fear and loss until their hearts burned within them, and with the benefit of hindsight, they learnt to distinguish good news from fake news. And in this morning's opening hymn, we were challenged to make of life's brief journey a new Emmaus road, because the transformation those two disciples experienced is just as much needed across the globe today. Which is why God is calling us to tell the world what has made our own hearts burn within us, so that we can offer good news to a world in which there is indeed way too much fear and loss. Amen.